think so.
Harder to hear
Yeah.
on the microphone.
It's okay, Kinsey, if I take it?
Yeah.
Yep.
So you're gonna talk about Eli Lilly and Pfizer fighting.
Good morning, everybody. Today we have Dr. Amilcar Chalu. He is an associate professor of history and department chair. He obtained his PhD from Harvard University. Dr. Chalu has used geographic information systems, statistical analysis, and disclosure analysis in the study of capitalism, environmental change, and living standards in Mexico and the Americas, resulting in more than 10 peer-reviewed articles and an edited volume. He actively collaborates with scholars in Europe, Latin America, and the United States. Dr. Chalu is a practitioner of what may be called applied history, the use of historical ways of analysis and interpretation in areas that go well beyond traditional historic narrative. He was the director of Stories in the Woods, a historical interpretive trail and information website displayed in spring of 2021 in the Winter Garden Natural Preserve in Bowling Green. He has served as a consultant and evaluator in public history projects throughout Northwest Ohio. During the onset of the COVID pandemic, he co-led towards a pedagogy crisis, a project funded by the National Endowment of the Humanities to build resilience and capacity in humanities programs at Bowling Green State University. Dr. Chalu has been interviewed by local TV stations, radios, and shows and podcasts. Today, his topic is going to be the drug policy in Latin America, and this issue of migration to the U.S. from Latin America has overshadowed the war on drugs, which has been underway for decades with little signs of progress. What are the roots of the bureaucratic logic behind today's dominant drug policies in Latin America? It is time to reconsider punitive drug control policies that disrupt supply chains and punish drug possession. I'll have you take it away now.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be back here. I think I talked like 2-3 times before, and I recall a few faces, and I always look forward to great decisions. And I hope that this is useful, this is thoughtful, that it brings topics to discuss and think about. There are, of course, no easy answers to the questions and to the problems, and that's part of the challenge here, to try to understand multiple perspectives and ways of thinking about these problems. So, the topic is a century of drug wars, and it's let me find the title again, because I found it interesting. Where is it? No End in Sight: a century of drug wars, right? And it's about primarily Latin America and U.S. relations with Latin America through the filter, or through the lens of drug policy. And I found the title super interesting. I always fret about my titles. I like titles to be conveying what one is saying, right? And a century of drug wars, no end in sight, right? As a historian, I know that the drug wars have not been a century, right, long. They started in the early 70s. But then century makes me think, oh, maybe the author is not talking about 1920, 2020. Maybe the author is talking about 1970, 2070. You know, what century is the author talking about? Anyway, that's a quick reaction on the title. But I put together a short presentation with some of the main points of this article, which I think is very rich, worth looking at. And I'm happy to have a discussion on any of the topics raised there. I have some questions inspired by the book, but also of my own that we may want to discuss. I will be going a little bit on a different route at some points than this article, just because I think that's why I'm here for, right? Not to echo what you can read, or but bring in other perspectives. So, can you all hear me okay? It works? Okay. And I know that I have sometimes a thick accent. I'm originally from Argentina. I've been living in Bolivia since 2005, so 17 years. But the accent always follows, right? And so Argentina right now, incidentally, is in the middle of its own drug wars. They are very different than Colombia and Mexico. But just a week ago, hundreds of people died out of a fight between two drug, I wouldn't call them cartels, but gangs, that basically what they did is they contaminated each other's drug and caused hundreds of deaths of consumers. But not hundreds, scores of deaths. So they are everywhere. I mean, and I know that we are covering the Americas, but we could also go beyond the Americas as well. Let's begin with, I think this is the main point of this article, right? That the drug policy has some unique features. The drug policy, particularly in the United States, has some features that are quite unique in the way that countries deal with drug addiction and drug trade. So one feature is that our policy focuses on limiting supply. It focuses on reducing production and prohibiting trade of drugs. And I'm not taking a stance on whether this is good or bad policy, but it's very much looking at the supply side, and it's not looking that much at the demand side, right? It's like, imagine that we want the opportunities to have like a healthy outdoor experience, right? What do we do as a society if we want to stimulate outdoor experiences? I think it's a nice part with the problem we have here. We have a beautiful Parks and Recreations division here in Bowling Green, right? We have the Wood County Parks division as well. They are fantastic. I've been working with them. What are they doing? They are making parks available, right? We are investing in buying some land, restoring it, creating different experiences so we can be outdoors. And if someone prefers being outdoors, walking in the woods, we have one. If someone prefers skating, we have the skate park, right? So we have a variety of services that address that need for being outdoor. Socially, we recognize that that's an important thing. Imagine if the policy, instead of being investing in the preserve, in parks, in recreation, would be to say, we are prohibiting the use of phones, of smartphones. We are prohibiting iPhones, Androids. We are prohibiting the TV because that keeps people inside the house, right? Maybe that's not going to work, so let's do something else. Let's start taxing gas and electricity so people would not have heating or air conditioner, and then they will go out, right? That's the hope of our drug policy, is that we can control the supply, not how we consume drugs, right? And it's unique to, I mean, many countries have this feature. But in the case of the United States, it's unique for a couple of reasons that I'll go down in a few minutes. So instead of focusing on the health side or the demand side, how we keep consumption low, we are trying to tackle how we keep supply, how we avoid production. The second feature is that the enforcement of these policy focus is punitive, right? And again, I'm not taking a stance on whether this is correct or not. And it's punitive domestically and it's punitive abroad. So domestically, of course, we have very high incarceration rates. I think the number is 30 million Americans are in jail for drug-related offenses. And it's also punitive abroad, right? It has particularly spent billions of dollars in high technology military equipment in Latin American countries to eradicate production. The third feature is that actually it's a very long tradition of this. And the title is right in that it says a century. I don't think it's a century of drug wars, but it's a century of punitive policies. So a century in which, beginning in the early 20th century, in 1909, I think, certain drugs were considered to be illicit and they could not be traded legally. This builds on a much longer tradition, also on the prohibition of alcohol and the prohibition of other, what we call vices. Okay. Now, even though it's a long tradition, particularly from the 1970s on, this policy has taken a new level, like a very much higher impact than before. And I think the author discusses this in length. So, is it the war on drugs or the drug of war? That will be my question. The thing is that the US is unique in some aspects. When we compare the United States to other countries, other particularly high-income countries, Europe, Australia, Japan, there's one characteristic that stands out. And it is that the price of drug here in the United States is much, much, much lower than in other places in the world. It's about less than half the price, cocaine is less than half the price of what it is in Europe, 5 times less than Australia. The second issue is that the degree of intervention of the United States in foreign affairs due to drug-related policy is very high. The United States is a world power. We have very powerful military and a lot of weight, right? International weight. Even if we do not do anything, when we do nothing, we still are doing something because of the weight of our international power, right? So it is very different what the drug policy is in the United States than what it is in Netherlands, because Netherlands really doesn't have much of an impact around. It does, but not too much, not compared to the United States. So, why is this a policy problem? What's wrong with it? Well, I think that the quote on prices, the mention to prices already indicates the problem, is that despite decades of spending in this policy, the price of drugs did not go up, right? That's what you would expect. If we are successful in cutting down production, the price will go up. That's supply and demand, basically, right? It hasn't gone up. Actually, the price of drug, the price of particularly cocaine, that's the one that is more important for this topic, went down from $200 a gram in 1990 to $160, maybe $180 in 2010. Those are the most recent numbers that I could get. So for all the effort that we put in interdiction, prohibition, and eradication of the cultivation, that has not reflected at all in the price of cocaine. Even more, when we look at the production, we see that production goes up and down. Typically, it goes down when a country's production is shut down, but then another country comes in, and in 1 year you have a bouncing effect. Production overall has not gone down either, it has increased. So drugs are as available, even more available than any time before. So that's why the policy is failure. It's intended to cut on drugs, and it's not doing it. And the second issue, why it's a failure, it is wrecking our society. Probably we all know someone who has been at least in rehabilitation, and how many deaths are we dealing with here in Wood County related to overdoses? And it's a public health issue, right? And it's also, as I said, like keeping 30 million Americans in jail as well, which, I mean, when we talk about illegal immigration, we are talking about 11 million people, right? So imagine if 30 million people were added to the labor market, what would be very, very different with the outcome. But that's why this is a problem in our society and many other societies in the developed world. But why is this a foreign policy issue? Well, because number one, it's creating so many incentives to corruption that it's corrupting states all over the hemisphere, all over the Americas. And these states are, some of them, at the brink of failure. In order not to fail, in order to assert their authority, they have to go through a more militaristic authoritarian route. So perhaps my first presentation here, almost 10 years ago, was about democratization in Latin America. And one of the most important, I would say, historical moments in Latin America is that wave of democratization from the 1980s, 1990s on. Right now, Latin America is the region of the world with more democratic institutions in the world, right? But the drug trade is lurking there, and it's creating a big threat on the rule of law. It's creating a big threat on how people believe or not in the state, and it's corrupting it from the inside. So when we have failed and corrupt states, the outcome is people that are much less satisfied with the state they are in, more instability, right? That feeds into other issues, right? Migration, refugees, and the number of people in, say, Central America leaving the country because of drug-related violence is huge. Same in Mexico, right? Colombia, I mean, we have entirely captured the middle class here in the United States. If we look at all the migration from Colombia here, it's very different than Mexico, but we have tons of middle class Colombians who left the country during the height of the most violent cycle in the drug wars in Colombia. So migration, then security. I mean, crime begets crime, right? And this could present significant security problems for the United States. Imagine the day that Venezuela starts funding its state with drug trade. Right now, there's some drug-related corruption in Venezuela, but not that much. Basically because they have oil, and that's their drug, to put it in a way. But imagine what would happen in that case, right? I was going to go off a tangent a little bit. And then the other issue is international reputation. The standing of the United States is also quite at stake in Latin American countries, because of the United States support of very punitive measures. So when we talk about punitive policies here in the States, mostly it's law enforcement, right? Is we have people going into jail for possession of minor amounts of drugs or major amounts of drugs. But the punitive policy, when you see it from the production side, is quite different. It's having the military coming into villages and burning fields, sometimes very indiscriminately. It's a violation of human rights. People are taken regardless of whether they are involved in a drug trade or not. Many people do not have a choice. They are threatened to participate in the drug trade. And a lot of these punitive actions that the United States is funding, they walk a very fine line in terms of human rights. And I'm being generous. So that stains the reputation of the United States as a country that is favoring basically paramilitary and very strong authoritarian style of military intervention. How are we doing? Do I keep talking or I stop? Yeah, okay. Now, the fact that it's a problem doesn't mean that, or that we can identify the problem doesn't mean that we can solve it. And that's a big problem for people like me, that we want to say, haha, this is the issue, but how we fix it, right? It's a wicked problem, it's complicated, extremely complicated. And I think that there are two characteristics that make this problem particularly complicated. And they are covered in, the first one is extensively covered in the book. And one is the plain economics of addiction. The plain economics of addiction. There are economic forces that, regardless of our policies, are extremely hard to manipulate, to move in the direction that you want. And it's mainly driven by very high demand of drugs and addictive demand. That is, even if the price goes up, you want to keep buying, right? You want to keep having. And this produces two types of displacements, as the text calls them. I would use the word substitution, but that's more like economics lingo. First is geographic displacement, right? And geographic displacement basically means that if we have Colombia producing cocaine, we take down Colombia. Boom, Colombia goes down. 100 tons of cocaine may go down temporarily off the market because they cannot produce. We took Colombia down. Imagine that that were possible. Well, the thing is that Peru is going to rise. Bolivia is going to rise. Mexico or Central America, right? There's going always to be someone else that is going to take the place of the one that is being displaced. Why? Because the margins are huge. The margins are huge. It costs $500 to buy enough coca leaves to make a ton of cocaine, or to make a kilo of cocaine, 2 pounds of cocaine, right? To make 2 pounds of cocaine, we need to have around 1,600 pounds of coca leaves. That costs $500. In the wholesale market, in the cheapest US market, those 2 pounds of cocaine are worth $25,000, right? So from production, $500, 600, to the cheapest place in the United States, $25,000, right, or $22,000, right? It's a huge margin, right? So the moment Mexico goes down, Colombia goes up. Colombia goes down, Mexico picks up. It's impossible to control all this at the same time as well, right? So that's called geographic displacement. But there's another type of displacement that it's also geographic, but it's actually, I think, more relevant to understanding the violence behind this. And that's what I call the cartel displacement. We can take down El Chapo, right? It's hard. No, it's not that easy to take down El Chapo and his cartel, but we can. The moment we take El Chapo down, the Zetas are up. There's another cartel taking their place. The moment we take Cali down, Medellin goes up, or the other way around. So our intervention focusing on targeting, say, El Chapo or one cartel or one drug line immediately generates more incentives for all the others to take place. There's something else there too that I want to, I mean, it may not be intuitive, but it's important. Drug trade is not like iPhones or Androids, right? Or Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, right? Where there are huge economies of scale. That means basically that being a company as big as Facebook, Google, Twitter, Apple, makes those companies reap huge benefits, right? Why? Because I have a great idea for a smartphone. Guess what? I'm never going to capture like not even 1,000 users. The barriers of entry for me to get there, the barriers of entry to me to get a good product that would sell out, that would sell, are minimal. In drug trade, that's not the case. Drug trade is very valuable. It depends a lot on local connections, depends a lot on knowing the connections, bribing the right people. Depends even more on being able to conceal the production, right? So rarely you're going to have this production of poppies or coca leaves like wide in the open fields, right? You need to conceal. It's typically in valleys, surrounded by other vegetation, etc. Places that are hard to get to. That makes it very, very difficult to monopolize. So the drug trade is not a monopoly by any stretch of imagination. So basically what that means is that when one of these cartels goes down, another one takes place right away. Then there's another type of displacement or substitution, and that's substance substitution. And that's a complicated one, I think, particularly difficult. Imagine that we can take down cocaine, right? And we succeed in doing that, at least short term. There's no more cocaine coming to the States. What's going to happen? We're going to synthetics, we're going to heroin, etc., right? Both heroin and synthetics were more expensive, right? And because they were more expensive, consumers would rather get cocaine rather than these more expensive products. But now the product is not that comparable. I mean, the price has become comparable, right? So people are switching from cocaine to heroin, or from heroin to synthetics or other opioids, just because they are substituting the substance. The addiction generates that desire to get something else. Quite often, that substance substitution, the new substance that takes the place of the old substance, tends to be even more dangerous and more addictive. So basically, that's a very common argument in legalization of marijuana. It's basically that by prohibiting marijuana, the price compared to cocaine is much more similar. So then you have people using the harder drug rather than the softer one. But regardless of how to deal with this, that's a fact. We replace one with the other. We don't have Advil, we get Tylenol, right? That's basically what it is. The other thing that makes it hard to contain is that this is like a perfect storm, like an intersection of very different processes at the same time, right? Let me lead with one question, right? Why we are not getting drugs from Canada? Why are not Canadians into the production and trade of drugs? Too cold, that will be one, but we get tomatoes from them, right? What else could be? Yeah.
There are other options, candidates for jobs.
Other options, other opportunities for jobs? Yes, right? Poverty levels are relatively low compared to neighbors in the south of the United States. That's one factor, that's super important, right? There are other opportunities. Why would you get into an illegal criminal activity if you can make a decent living in other activities? That's a big one. There's another one too, and I would say that the Canadian state, like the American state, and like some states in Latin America, are much stronger in what they can do, right? They have more support networks, they have more social security, or they have more law enforcement as well, or they have rule of law, right? And once you have those institutions in place, and you have that kind of strong state, it's much more difficult for these criminal organizations to erode that rule of law. When the state is thinner, when the state is weaker, then it's way more likely that corruption can make a huge impact. And that's what I have in the perfect storm. And I couldn't find a good graph of storm, but otherwise that would have been my desired representation. So I got the gears, the clogs of the drug wars, but we have on the one hand, in this perfect storm, high demand in the United States. It's not only high demand, it's high demand by one of the richest, wealthiest countries in the world, right? We have a lot of disposable income. We have a lot of money, even when we don't have money, that's way more money than the majority of the world. So there's a lot of this income and a lot of demand for drugs. Then we don't live in Australia, right? If we live in Australia, we are insulated. It's a big island, right? So it's more expensive to bring in drugs from outside. It's not impossible, by no stretch of imagination, but it's more difficult. The United States has very porous borders and very long borders. Not only that, even if we built like a huge wall to divide up the United States from Canada and Mexico, and we could patrol all the seas as well, we have huge amounts of trade. Drug is smuggled in gas tanks, right? Drugs are smuggled in between containers. If we were to open each single container, and from each single container, each single little piece inside the container, we will stop trade at all. And we depend critically on that trade, right? It's not that we can say, it's over. We're not going to trade with anybody anymore because drugs are smuggled in. We would not have chairs, tables, microphones, phones, coffee, anything, right? So we depend very critically on that trade. Not only we buy things from abroad, we also export abroad, right? So that's what it means that the borders are porous, right? That they are permeable, they leak all the time. It's not just the geography itself, it's also trade. Trade makes it more difficult to control. But that's on the US side. On the side of Latin American countries, I think that these two issues that we pointed out with the example of Canada as the counterexample, I think are very important. One is a thin state, and the other is poverty, the lack of opportunities, as you said, right? In Latin American countries are middle-income countries. They are not the poorest in the world by no stretch of imagination. But there's very high inequality, and there are many people in poverty. Sometimes 40, 50% of the population live in poverty, or even more. That poverty also means poverty traps, right? When poverty is entrenched for a long period in a country, it typically means that there are some poverty traps, that people have a problem in finding opportunities to get out of poverty. The drug trade appears then in a very compelling way, right? Because you may not be able to support your family, you have to do something, right? And that could be what producing coca leaves for drug lords may give you, like just that basic level of income. It may mean that that people are recruited into working in the trade itself as smugglers or in security, etc. So poverty is a main driver. These countries in which we have a lot of drug trade and drug production, they are countries that have some characteristics. Some are geographical, but they all have something in common. They have a very high percent of the population living in poverty. Countries where poverty is existing, but not that prevalent. And I would name Chile, I would name Costa Rica. They are not that well known for the drug trade. Are there drugs there? Yes, but they are not the main players. And they are not major players at all in international drug trade. But the other is thin state. I mentioned again Costa Rica and Chile. These are two countries that have institutions that are relatively solid. Relatively, I mean, I don't want to overplay. And particularly Chile has been going through a lot in these last 3 years. But they have institutions that are more in place, that are working to provide social services, to provide education, that have more trust in the state as well than other countries. Quite the contrary, the case of, I can speak about Mexico, the case that I know much more. In the case of Mexico, it's quite the contrary, what we may call a thin state. It's a state that perennially has trouble getting enough revenue to sustain the bureaucracy. Of all the countries in the OCDE, the Organization of Developed Economies, Mexico is the one that stands out by having much less taxes, lower level of taxation than any other country among all industrialized countries. And that translates into low wages for state officers. That translates into court systems that don't work that well. Law enforcement doesn't work that well. Social programs are very clientelistic. They are very much oriented to get the support of some constituencies for voting purposes and not more than that. So when you have that thin state combined with this opportunity, economic opportunity for people living in the margins, living just eking by, eking out a living, then you have that drug trade can be way more pervasive and way more destructive of that already thin state that we have, right? Does this make sense? Okay, so I'm done. Those were the points that I wanted to make, and I wanted to end with a few questions that we can discuss, or your own questions. I just put there in case that any of them appears interesting. I draw them primarily from the book, but I added a couple of my own as well. So I will stop there and